The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Kensington Palace as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what felt like the 1000th time that week. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons, a detail that would have horrified him just months earlier when precision and composure were as natural to him as breathing. At 42 years old, Morrison had served the royal family for nearly 2 decades, earning respect and commendation for his unwavering dedication and flawless service record. The weight of his bearskin hat felt heavier than usual as he took his position outside the palace gates. The morning crowds were already gathering, tourists and royal watchers hoping to catch a glimpse of the working royals as they went about their daily duties. Morrison's trained eyes automatically scanned the crowd, looking for anything unusual or potentially threatening, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a maze of personal struggles that had been building for months. His wife Sarah had been battling cancer for the past year, undergoing aggressive treatment that drained not only her strength, but also their savings. The medical bills were mounting despite the National Health Service coverage, as they sought private treatments that might give Sarah a better chance. Their teenage daughter Emma was struggling in school, acting out in ways that Morrison didn't understand, spending her time with friends he didn't approve of, and coming home at hours that made him worry sick. The financial pressure was crushing. Morrison's salary, while respectable, wasn't enough to cover the mounting expenses. The mortgage on their modest home in Surrey was behind by 3 months, and the threatening letters from the bank had started arriving with alarming frequency. He had applied for additional loans, but his debt-to-income ratio was already stretched thin. Sleep had become elusive, replaced by hours of staring at the ceiling, calculating numbers that never seemed to add up to anything hopeful. Morrison's supervisor, Captain Williams, had noticed the changes in his behavior. The usually punctual guard had been arriving minutes late, his uniform sometimes slightly askew, and his responses to routine questions had become shorter, more clipped. During their last performance review, Williams had gently inquired about Morrison's well-being, but Morrison had deflected with practiced military efficiency, insisting everything was fine. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison that he spent his days protecting one of the wealthiest families in the world while his own family struggled to survive. He wasn't bitter about the vast difference in circumstances. He had chosen this career path and took pride in serving the crown. But the contrast had become more painful as his personal situation deteriorated. Every day he stood guard over people who would never know the anxiety of choosing between heating bills and groceries, who would never lie awake wondering how to afford their child's school supplies. His fellow guards had noticed his distraction too. Morrison, once known for his sharp wit and camaraderie, had become withdrawn during breaks. He no longer joined the informal conversations that helped pass the long hours of standing duty. His responses to colleagues' concerns were brief and dismissive, building walls where there had once been friendship and mutual support. The stress was manifesting physically as well. Morrison's back ached constantly from the rigid posture required during his shifts, made worse by the tension he carried in his shoulders. His appetite had disappeared, and he had lost nearly 20 pounds over the past few months, making his uniform hang loosely on his frame. The palace physician had noticed during a routine health check and recommended Morrison see his personal doctor, advice that Morrison couldn't afford to follow without the insurance complications that might affect his security clearance. On this particular morning, as Morrison took his position for what should have been a routine ceremonial duty, the convergence of all these pressures created a perfect storm brewing beneath his professional exterior. The tourists were more numerous than usual, their voices louder and more demanding as they pressed against the barriers, trying to get better photos and asking endless questions about the royal family's schedule. Morrison's radio crackled with routine updates from the security team inside the palace. Princess Charlotte was scheduled for a public appearance later in the morning, which meant increased crowds and heightened security protocols. At 9 years old, she had become increasingly popular with the public, her natural charm and genuine interactions making her a favorite subject for photographers and royal watchers. As the morning progressed, the crowd's energy intensified. A group of American tourists had positioned themselves directly in front of Morrison's post, talking loudly about their expectations for seeing the royal family. Their comments, while innocent, grated on Morrison's already frayed nerves. They spoke about the royals as if they were entertainment, discussing their clothing choices and personal lives with the casual familiarity of gossip columnists. Behind his stoic expression, Morrison felt something beginning to crack. The careful compartmentalization that had allowed him to separate his professional duties from his personal struggles was starting to fail. Every cheerful comment from tourists about the royal family's privileged life felt like salt in an open wound. His breathing became slightly more labored, though his training kept his posture rigid and his expression neutral. The morning sun grew stronger, making the heavy ceremonial uniform uncomfortably warm. Sweat began to gather under Morrison's bearskin hat and along his collar, but protocol demanded he remain motionless except for the prescribed ceremonial movements. The physical discomfort added another layer to his mounting stress, creating a feedback loop that made concentration increasingly difficult. Morrison's thoughts drifted to the conversation he would need to have with Sarah that evening. The latest treatment wasn't showing the progress they had hoped for, and the oncologist had mentioned more expensive options that their insurance wouldn't cover. The look in Sarah's eyes when she tried to be brave about their financial situation haunted him during these long hours of standing duty. A particularly loud burst of laughter from the tourist group snapped Morrison back to the present moment. His jaw clenched involuntarily, and, for just a second, his carefully maintained composure flickered. He took a deep breath, trying to reset his focus, but the damage was done. The professional mask he had worn for 20 years was beginning to slip, and there was still hours left in his shift. The radio crackled again with an update about Princess Charlotte's imminent arrival. Morrison straightened his shoulders, trying to summon the pride and purpose that had sustained him throughout his career. But underneath the surface, the pressure continued to build, threatening to overwhelm the discipline and training that had defined his professional identity for so long. As the morning crowd grew larger and more boisterous, Morrison realized he was fighting a battle on two fronts: maintaining his duty to the royal family while struggling with personal demons that seemed determined to destroy everything he had worked to build. The irony of protecting others while feeling utterly unprotected himself wasn't lost on him, and that realization only added to the weight threatening to crush his carefully constructed professional persona. The first crack in Morrison's composure came when a young man in the crowd began making jokes about the royal family's wealth while pretending to bow mockingly toward the palace gates. His friends laughed loudly, encouraging the performance as they filmed it on their phones for social media. Under normal circumstances, Morrison would have ignored such behavior. He had seen far worse over the years and had learned to tune out the occasional disrespectful tourist. But these weren't normal circumstances. Morrison's sleep-deprived mind latched onto the young man's comments about royal privilege and excess, each word hitting like a physical blow. The jokes about never having to worry about money, about having servants for everything, about living in luxury while others struggled, felt like they were aimed directly at Morrison's personal situation rather than being general commentary about the monarchy. Morrison's breathing became shallower, and his vision seemed to narrow as tunnel vision set in. The sounds around him became distorted, with the crowd's chatter seeming both distant and overwhelming at the same time. His training kicked in automatically, keeping him upright and in position, but inside his mind was racing between thoughts of Sarah's medical bills and Emma's increasingly defiant behavior. The breaking point came when a middle-aged woman approached the barrier directly in front of Morrison's position. She was well-dressed and spoke with the confident tone of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. She demanded to know why the guards couldn't just tell the crowd when Princess Charlotte would appear, complaining loudly that she had been waiting for over an hour and had important places to be. When Morrison didn't respond immediately, following protocol to remain silent unless directly addressed about security matters, the woman became more agitated. She began speaking about him as if he weren't there, commenting to her companion about how the guards were probably just trying to look important by being mysterious. Her voice carried clearly in the morning air as she criticized the entire system of royal protection, calling it outdated and unnecessarily dramatic. Morrison felt something snap inside his chest, like a rubber band stretched too far finally, breaking. 20 years of maintaining perfect composure while enduring criticism, complaints, and disrespect from people who had no understanding of the dedication required for his job suddenly felt unbearable. The woman's entitled attitude and casual dismissal of his service became the final straw on top of months of accumulated stress and desperation. Without warning, Morrison stepped forward from his ceremonial position. The movement itself was shocking. Royal guards simply didn't break protocol during active duty. The crowd immediately noticed the deviation, and conversations began to quiet as people turned their attention to the unusual behavior. Morrison's voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse and strained from hours of silence and months of suppressed emotion. He began quietly, almost talking to himself, but his words carried in the sudden hush that had fallen over the immediate area. He started by muttering about people who complained about everything without understanding anything, his Scottish accent becoming more pronounced as his emotional control deteriorated. The woman who had triggered his response stepped back, suddenly, uncertain as she realized the guard was addressing her directly. Morrison's eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights and bright with unshed tears, focused on her with an intensity that made several people in the crowd uncomfortable. His hands, still gloved and formally positioned, began to shake visibly as weeks of suppressed anxiety manifested physically. Morrison began to speak more loudly, his voice cracking as he talked about standing for hours protecting people who would never know his name or care about his struggles. He spoke about the weight of the uniform that represented duty and honor while his own family fell apart around him. The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had burst and months of held-back emotion were flooding out all at once. Other guards stationed nearby heard the commotion and began moving subtly toward Morrison's position, recognizing that their colleague was experiencing some kind of breakdown. Captain Williams received an urgent radio message about the situation and began making his way from inside the palace, knowing that any public incident involving royal security would require immediate and careful management. Morrison's outburst intensified as he spoke about the impossibility of maintaining dignity and professionalism while watching his wife suffer through cancer treatments they could barely afford. His voice rose as he described the shame of falling behind on mortgage payments while protecting people who owned multiple palaces. The crowd around him was now completely silent, some people beginning to back away while others recorded the unprecedented scene on their phones. The royal guard's carefully maintained facade continued to crumble as he spoke about Emma, his teenage daughter, who was making choices that terrified him because he was too exhausted and stressed to be the father she needed. His voice broke completely as he admitted that he sometimes resented the very people he had sworn to protect, not because they were bad people, but because the contrast between their security and his vulnerability had become too painful to bear. Morrison's military training warred with his emotional breakdown, creating a disturbing spectacle of a man caught between his professional identity and his personal desperation. He remained roughly in position, but his rigid posture had dissolved into something more human and therefore more heartbreaking. His bearskin hat sat slightly askew, and his white gloves were now stained with tears he couldn't stop. The crowd had grown larger as word spread that something unusual was happening at the palace gates. Social media posts were already beginning to circulate, with videos and photos of the breaking guard spreading across various platforms. The palace's public relations team was being alerted to the developing situation, knowing that any incident involving royal security would require immediate damage control. Captain Williams arrived at Morrison's position and attempted to speak quietly to his subordinate, trying to de-escalate the situation without drawing more attention. But Morrison was beyond hearing reasonable words or following orders. Months of careful emotional regulation had given way to raw, unfiltered pain that demanded expression regardless of the consequences. Morrison began to pace within a small area near his post, his movements erratic and unpredictable. He continued speaking, sometimes to the crowd, sometimes to Williams, and sometimes seemingly to himself. His words became a stream of consciousness recounting of financial pressures, medical fears, and the growing certainty that he was failing everyone who depended on him. The situation was rapidly becoming untenable. More security personnel were arriving, and discussions were taking place about how to remove Morrison from public view without creating an even bigger spectacle. The palace's crisis management protocols were being activated, with staff members already drafting statements about the incident and preparing for media inquiries. Morrison seemed unaware of the larger implications of his breakdown, focused entirely on the immediate relief of finally expressing the pain he had been carrying alone for so long. His voice grew hoarse from the unaccustomed strain of speaking continuously after hours of ceremonial silence, but the words continued to pour out as if his very survival depended on being heard and understood. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people looked on with obvious sympathy, recognizing the human suffering behind the uniform, while others seemed uncomfortable witnessing such a raw display of vulnerability from someone they expected to embody strength and stoicism. Children in the crowd began to cry, frightened by the adults' obvious distress, while their parents tried to shield them from the disturbing scene. As Morrison's breakdown continued, it became clear that this was more than a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the complete collapse of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits while trying to maintain an impossible standard of perfection in both his professional and personal life. Princess Charlotte had been watching the commotion from an upstairs window in Kensington Palace, her small hands pressed against the glass as she observed the unusual scene unfolding below. At 9 years old, she possessed the natural curiosity of childhood combined with the heightened awareness that came from growing up in the public eye. She had been preparing for her scheduled public appearance when the disturbance began, and her personal protection officer had initially tried to redirect her attention away from the windows. But Charlotte was not easily distracted when something captured her interest. She had observed Morrison during many previous occasions, noting how he always stood perfectly straight and never seemed to move or speak. The sight of him pacing and gesturing animatedly was so unusual that it demanded investigation. Her governess, Mrs. Patterson, attempted to explain that sometimes adults had difficult days and needed space, but Charlotte's intuitive nature told her this was more than just a bad day. The 9-year-old princess had an unusual ability to read people's emotions, a skill that had developed from years of observing the careful interactions between adults in her highly structured world. She could sense when someone was genuinely happy versus when they were performing happiness for public consumption. Morrison's distress was so raw and authentic that even from her distant observation point, Charlotte could feel the genuine pain radiating from the scene below. Charlotte had experienced her own moments of feeling overwhelmed by expectations and responsibilities that seemed too large for a child to handle. The constant public attention, the need to behave perfectly at all times, and the weight of representing her family's reputation had sometimes made her feel isolated and misunderstood. While her struggles were vastly different from Morrison's, she recognized the emotion of someone feeling trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Against the advice of her protection team, and despite Mrs. Patterson's gentle protests, Charlotte made a decision that would later be described by palace staff as both completely unexpected and entirely characteristic of her developing personality. She announced her intention to go outside and speak with the distressed guard, displaying the kind of stubborn determination that her family knew well but that often surprised adults who expected royal children to be passive and obedient. Captain Williams was still attempting to manage Morrison's breakdown when word reached him that Princess Charlotte was requesting permission to approach the situation. The idea was immediately dismissed as impossible. Royal protocol strictly forbade exposing any member of the family to unpredictable situations, and Morrison's emotional state made him a potential security risk. But Charlotte had already begun making her way toward the palace's main entrance, accompanied by a growing entourage of concerned staff members. The princess had changed from her formal appearance outfit into more casual clothes, explaining to her dresser that fancy clothing might make the sad guard feel worse about his situation. Her thinking, while childlike in its simplicity, showed a sophisticated understanding of how symbols of wealth and status might affect someone experiencing financial distress. She chose a simple blue dress and comfortable shoes, wanting to appear as normal and approachable as possible. Morrison's outburst had begun to wind down from sheer exhaustion when he noticed a commotion near the palace entrance. Through his tear-blurred vision, he saw a small figure in blue approaching, surrounded by several adults who seemed to be having an animated discussion. As the group drew closer, Morrison realized with shock that Princess Charlotte herself was walking directly toward his position. The crowd, which had been captivated by Morrison's breakdown, now found itself witnessing something even more unprecedented. A young member of the royal family approaching a situation that protocol would normally keep her far away from. Phones appeared again as people realized they were about to witness an interaction between the distressed guard and the princess he had sworn to protect. Charlotte's protection officer stayed close beside her, ready to intervene if Morrison's behavior became threatening, but the princess showed no fear as she approached. Her natural empathy overrode any concern for her own safety, and her years of training in public appearances gave her confidence in handling unusual social situations. She had often been told that part of her role was to bring comfort to people who were suffering, though this was certainly not the type of scenario anyone had envisioned when teaching her that lesson. Morrison attempted to compose himself when he realized Princess Charlotte was approaching, his military training reasserting itself despite his emotional state. He tried to straighten his uniform and wipe his face, mortified that a member of the royal family was seeing him in such a condition. His years of service had been dedicated to maintaining dignity and professionalism in her presence, and the complete reversal of that dynamic left him feeling even more vulnerable and ashamed. Charlotte stopped a few feet away from Morrison, her young face serious but kind as she looked up at the much taller adult. She had been coached throughout her life on proper protocol for public interactions, but this situation fell completely outside normal parameters. Instead of following formal procedures, she relied on the same instincts that guided her interactions with classmates or staff members when they seemed upset. The crowd had grown silent again, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the most cynical observers found themselves holding their breath as the small princess faced the broken man who had dedicated his career to her family's service. The juxtaposition of her composed innocence against his raw vulnerability created a scene that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Morrison tried to speak, to apologize for his behavior and reassure the princess that she was safe, but his voice failed him completely. The combination of emotional exhaustion and overwhelming shame at being seen in such a state by someone he was meant to protect left him unable to form coherent words. He stood frozen, caught between his desire to maintain professional distance and his desperate need for human understanding and compassion. Charlotte seemed to understand intuitively that Morrison needed permission to be human rather than just a uniformed symbol. Her approach was gentle but direct, displaying the kind of emotional intelligence that often develops in children who have learned to navigate complex social dynamics. She looked directly into Morrison's eyes, offering him the basic respect of being seen as a person rather than just a function. The princess began to speak in her clear, young voice, cutting through the tension and uncertainty that had gripped everyone present. Her words were simple but carefully chosen, reflecting both her natural compassion and the training she had received in how to comfort people during difficult times. What she said next would transform the entire situation and provide Morrison with something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine human connection from someone who, despite her privileged position, seemed to truly understand his pain. Morrison's reaction to Charlotte's presence and words would mark the beginning of his journey back from the edge of complete breakdown, though neither of them could have predicted the profound impact their brief interaction would have on everyone who witnessed it. The crowd, the palace staff, and even the hardened security professionals found themselves moved by the sight of a child offering comfort to an adult whose world had temporarily fallen apart. The moment represented something deeper than just crisis management or public relations. It was a genuine human connection that transcended protocol, class differences, and the careful boundaries that usually defined interactions within the royal sphere. Princess Charlotte's first words to Morrison were simple but profound in their directness. "You look like you need a friend right now." Her young voice carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere, and those 8 words seemed to cut through all the complexity of protocol, hierarchy, and professional boundaries that had made Morrison's situation feel so isolated and insurmountable. Morrison's immediate reaction was to try to deflect attention from his personal struggles, attempting to resume his professional demeanor despite his obvious emotional distress. But Charlotte's next question stopped him completely. "Is your family okay?" The 9-year-old's intuitive understanding that his breakdown stemmed from personal rather than professional concerns demonstrated an emotional maturity that surprised even the experienced palace staff, who knew her well. Charlotte had grown up surrounded by adults who often spoke in careful, diplomatic language that obscured their real meanings. She had learned to listen for the emotions behind the words, and Morrison's raw honesty during his breakdown had communicated his genuine suffering more clearly than any formal report could have. Her response was equally direct, cutting through pretense to address the human being behind the uniform. Morrison found himself answering her question honestly, something he hadn't been able to do with his supervisors, colleagues, or even some of his closest friends. He told her about Sarah's cancer, speaking softly so that only Charlotte and the nearby security personnel could hear. He explained that his wife was very sick and the treatments were expensive, and that he worried constantly about her and their daughter Emma. Charlotte listened with the kind of focused attention that children often give to adults when they sense they're being trusted with important information. Her face showed genuine concern as Morrison spoke, and she asked follow-up questions that demonstrated both her natural empathy and her understanding that sometimes people needed to talk about their problems in order to feel better. When Morrison mentioned Emma's struggles in school and his worry that he wasn't being a good enough father. Charlotte's response surprised everyone within earshot. She told him that her own father sometimes worked so much that she missed him, but that she knew he loved her even when he couldn't be there. Her simple observation that love doesn't disappear just because someone is busy or worried helped Morrison see his relationship with Emma from a different perspective. The princess then did something that would be talked about in palace circles for months afterward. She asked Morrison if she could meet his family, explaining that she sometimes visited hospitals and schools where she met people who were dealing with difficult situations. Her suggestion wasn't made with the formality of a royal engagement, but with the genuine interest of a child who had been moved by someone else's story. Captain Williams, who had been monitoring the conversation carefully, realized that Princess Charlotte's informal intervention was accomplishing more in minutes than hours of official counseling and support might have achieved. Morrison's posture had begun to straighten, not with military rigidity, but with the kind of composure that comes from feeling understood and supported. His breathing had steadied, and the desperate edge in his voice had softened considerably. Charlotte continued the conversation by sharing some of her own experiences with public pressure and the challenge of always having to behave correctly. While her struggles were vastly different from Morrison's, her willingness to acknowledge that even princesses sometimes felt overwhelmed created a sense of shared humanity that bridged their different circumstances. She spoke about missing normal childhood activities and sometimes feeling lonely despite being surrounded by people. Morrison found himself offering comfort to Charlotte in return, his protective instincts extending beyond his professional duties to genuine concern for her well-being. The role reversal was therapeutic for both of them. Charlotte felt heard and understood in a way that adults often failed to provide, while Morrison rediscovered his capacity to care for others despite his own struggles. The crowd that had gathered to witness Morrison's breakdown now found themselves observing something much more profound, a genuine moment of human connection that transcended all the usual barriers of age, class, and circumstance. Many people were openly moved by the sight of the young princess offering comfort to the distressed guard, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare and authentic. Charlotte's natural leadership qualities emerged as she began to take charge of the situation in her own way. She asked Captain Williams if Morrison could have some water and a chance to sit down, making her requests with the kind of polite authority that she had learned from watching her family handle public situations. Her concern was practical as well as emotional, showing an understanding that caring for someone requires attention to their immediate physical needs. The princess also began to engage with the crowd that had gathered, explaining in her clear young voice that sometimes adults needed help and kindness just like children did. Her impromptu lesson in empathy transformed the atmosphere from one of curiosity and entertainment to something more thoughtful and compassionate. People who had been recording the incident began to put away their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that deserved respect rather than exploitation. Morrison's transformation during his conversation with Charlotte was visible to everyone present. The desperate, broken man who had been consumed by anxiety and despair began to show glimpses of the dedicated professional he had been for 20 years. Charlotte's validation of his struggles and her genuine interest in his family's well-being provided him with something he had been lacking for months: hope that his situation could improve. The princess suggested that Morrison might benefit from talking to the palace's employee assistance program, but she framed the suggestion as something that might help him be an even better protector for her family rather than as an admission of weakness or failure. Her intuitive understanding of how to preserve his dignity while encouraging him to seek help demonstrated wisdom far beyond her years. Charlotte's intervention also had an immediate practical impact. Captain Williams, inspired by her example, began to think about how the palace's support systems for staff members might be improved. The incident had highlighted gaps in their care for employees facing personal crises, and Charlotte's compassionate response provided a model for how those gaps might be addressed. As their conversation continued, Morrison began to see his situation from a different perspective. Charlotte's questions about what he loved most about his job reminded him of the pride and purpose that had sustained him throughout his career. Her interest in the history and traditions of the Royal Guard helped him reconnect with the sense of honor that had been overwhelmed by his recent struggles. The princess also made practical suggestions that demonstrated her understanding of real-world problems despite her privileged upbringing. She asked if Morrison's family had considered applying for assistance programs, and she mentioned that the palace sometimes helped staff members connect with resources for medical care and financial planning. Charlotte's natural ability to see solutions rather than just problems began to influence Morrison's thinking. Instead of feeling trapped by circumstances beyond his control, he started to consider options and possibilities that had been obscured by his desperation and exhaustion. The princess's optimism wasn't naive. It was grounded in a genuine belief that people could help each other overcome difficulties when they worked together. The transformation in the atmosphere around the palace gates was remarkable as Princess Charlotte continued her impromptu intervention. What had begun as a crisis requiring damage control had evolved into something entirely different, a teaching moment about compassion, understanding, and the power of human connection. The crowd that had initially gathered out of curiosity was now witnessing something that would influence how they thought about both the royal family and their own capacity for empathy. Morrison's conversation with Charlotte had given him something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. The princess's practical questions about his family's situation had helped him think more clearly about potential solutions, while her emotional support had reminded him that his struggles didn't define his worth as a person or a professional. For the first time in weeks, he could envision a path forward that didn't involve complete despair. Charlotte's suggestion about visiting Morrison's family had initially seemed impossible due to security protocols and scheduling constraints. However, Captain Williams found himself seriously considering how such a visit might be arranged. The princess's genuine interest wasn't a publicity stunt or formal royal engagement. It was a personal commitment to someone she had connected with during a moment of crisis. The princess had also accomplished something that the palace's human resources department had been trying to achieve for months. Morrison was now willing to accept help from the Employee Assistance Program, seeing it not as an admission of failure, but as a resource that could help him better serve the royal family. Charlotte's reframing of support services as tools for professional excellence rather than remedies for personal weakness had removed the stigma that had prevented Morrison from seeking help earlier. As news of the incident began to spread through palace staff networks, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Rather than viewing Morrison's breakdown as a security failure or public relations disaster, colleagues saw it as a reminder of the human cost of their demanding profession. Charlotte's compassionate response had created space for honest conversations about stress, mental health, and the importance of supporting one another. The immediate practical outcomes of Charlotte's intervention were significant. Captain Williams arranged for Morrison to take compassionate leave to address his family's medical and financial situations. The palace's administrative staff began working with Morrison to understand his specific challenges and identify resources that could help. Charlotte's suggestion that the royal family might be able to connect Sarah with better medical care was being seriously explored through appropriate channels. Morrison's relationship with his daughter Emma also benefited from his conversation with Charlotte. The princess's insights about children needing to know they are loved even when parents are stressed had given Morrison a new perspective on his interactions with his teenage daughter. He realized that his emotional distance, intended to protect Emma from his worries, had actually made her feel abandoned and confused about his feelings toward her. The crowd that had witnessed the entire incident dispersed gradually, many people carrying with them a changed perception of the royal family. Charlotte's natural empathy and genuine concern for Morrison's well-being had demonstrated that the monarchy's public commitment to service extended to personal, individual acts of compassion. Social media posts about the incident focused not on Morrison's breakdown, but on Charlotte's remarkable maturity and kindness. Morrison's colleagues rallied around him in ways that might not have happened if Charlotte hadn't normalized the idea that struggling guards deserved support rather than judgment. Her example had given permission for others to acknowledge their own challenges and seek help when needed. The palace's approach to employee mental health and financial wellness would be permanently influenced by the lessons learned from this incident. Charlotte's own understanding of her role and responsibilities was also deepened by her interaction with Morrison. She had discovered that her position could be used not just for formal public duties, but for direct, personal interventions that made real differences in people's lives. Her confidence in her ability to help others grew significantly, and she began to seek out more opportunities to connect with palace staff members on a personal level. The princess had also learned valuable lessons about the complex lives of the adults around her. Her sheltered upbringing had been balanced by this exposure to real struggle and genuine human pain. Morrison's honesty about his family's challenges had given Charlotte a more mature understanding of the world beyond palace walls, preparing her for future public roles that would require her to engage with people facing various difficulties. Morrison's recovery wasn't immediate or complete, but Charlotte's intervention had provided him with the foundation he needed to begin rebuilding his life. The financial pressures hadn't disappeared, Sarah's medical treatment continued to be challenging, and Emma still required patient parenting through her teenage struggles. However, Morrison now had hope, support, and a renewed sense of purpose that made these challenges feel manageable rather than overwhelming. The long-term impact of Charlotte's actions extended far beyond Morrison's personal situation. Her spontaneous demonstration of empathy and leadership became a defining moment in her own development as a public figure. Palace staff began to see her not just as a child who needed protection, but as someone with unique gifts for connecting with people and inspiring positive change. Morrison returned to active duty several weeks later, his professional competence restored, and his personal situation stabilized through the combination of palace support and community resources that Charlotte's intervention had helped him access. His experience became a case study within palace security circles for the importance of comprehensive staff wellness programs and the value of early intervention when employees face personal crises. The relationship between Morrison and Princess Charlotte continued to evolve in appropriate ways that respected both protocol and their genuine connection. Morrison's dedication to her protection was now informed by personal gratitude as well as professional duty, while Charlotte's understanding of the people who served her family was enriched by her knowledge of Morrison's story and recovery. Years later, Morrison would often reflect on the moment when a 9-year-old princess had saved his career, his family, and possibly his life through nothing more than kindness, wisdom, and the courage to break protocol when human need demanded it. Charlotte's intervention had demonstrated that true leadership often requires the willingness to step outside established boundaries to serve a higher purpose. The incident became legendary within palace circles, not because of the crisis it represented, but because of the transformation it produced. Charlotte's natural instincts for compassion and justice had been validated and strengthened by the success of her intervention, setting the foundation for a lifetime of meaningful public service guided by genuine care for others. Morrison's story also became a powerful reminder that everyone, regardless of their professional competence or personal strength, sometimes needs help and support to navigate life's challenges. Charlotte's example had shown that offering such support isn't just the responsibility of formal programs or trained professionals. It's a fundamental human obligation that anyone can fulfill through empathy, understanding, and the willingness to truly see and hear another person's experience.